Hello Internet, and welcome to this, my fourth attempt at shooting this video about the saving of the Danish Jews during the Second World War. This is a subject someone has asked me to talk about, and it is a subject that I felt was interesting because it's one of the few things during the Second World War Denmark actually has to be proud about, and as you may have noticed, I'm not overly keen on talking about things that Denmark can't be proud about because, hey, it's my country. I'm going to have to do this as a vlog because I try to do it in my usual style with slides and then just talking over it because that's the way I can actually do at least a little bit of editing without making it seem overly horrible because, as you all know, my editing software is basically iPhone's movie maker, so, whatever. But anyway, the damn program keeps cutting out on me when I reach the 6-minute mark, and since that's when we usually get to about the good stuff, I have decided to just sit here and blather at the phone instead. This will of course mean that my editing possibilities will be even worse than usual. So yeah, if you suddenly see some weird cuts in the video, that's probably because I have to actually stop talking because I blathered on about something or missed where I wanted to go and had to start reshooting. And anyway, enough apologies. The saving of the Danish Jews during the Second World War. Enjoy. Alright, a little backstory. In the early 1940, more specifically April 9th, 1940, Hitler's armies overran Denmark. We had been somewhat aware that something like that might occur, but the then sitting government was under the impression that the Germans were fairly invincible and any attempt at fighting them probably wouldn't lead to good things. So apart from a little bit of skirmishing near the Danish-German border in Jutland, and there wasn't really much fighting, and the whole thing was over in, basically a day. The Danish government recommended to the king that we surrendered, and since we are a constitutional monarchy, he agreed to do with what his, ministers wanted. So Denmark surrendered to the Germans and spent several years trying to, adapt in a peaceful and cooperative fashion as possible to the Nazi regime. This doesn't mean that the Danish population was keen on the whole thing, doesn't mean that the Danish population as a whole was German-friendly. Denmark hasn't been German-friendly for about 700 years, and we certainly wasn't during the Second World War, but on the whole it was felt that the government had basically given us up. There was no army. Denmark is a very small country. It's really hard to set up a resistance group because where are they going to hide? Everything would have to be in the big cities, but the big cities were also where the Germans were crowding. We don't really have a, back country to escape to, and so on and so on and so on. So, for the first couple of years, back up until somewhere in 42, Denmark was the sort of poster boy country for Nazi occupation. We were sending them a lot of agricultural food stuff. We were a fairly peaceful country. We were somewhere the Germans could send their frontline troops if they needed to, say, be recuperated in a friendly country, and they couldn't without actually bringing them home. Excuse me. However, in late 1942, of course, the war started turning against the Germans. I'm not going to go into a major Second World War thingy here, but the setbacks on the Eastern Front, the setbacks in Africa, and it became sort of obvious to everyone that we didn't necessarily have to see a future where it was just Germany, Grand Germany forever, and the Danish population saw an opening and started to a certain degree fighting back. The first resistance, actual active militant resistance cells were formed. There were a bunch of national-wide strikes. The government started trying to deny some German demands, or at least arguing with them and so on, and eventually in 1943 Hitler had enough with this little annoying country and decided to strike back. There was a movement to place the country under direct military rule instead of the German civil administration that had been in place for quite a while, and of course he decided that it was time to get rid of the Danish Jews, to arrest them and send them to various extermination camps in Eastern Europe. A bit more background, again, excuse me for a second, this is live, to a degree. Denmark had about 7,000, just over 7,000 Jews during the 1940s, most of them clustered around Copenhagen. However, they'd been in the country for centuries at this point, and they were incredibly well integrated. There wasn't really any anti-Semitism in Denmark in the 1940s. The Jews were just Danes. They had a different religion, yes, and it had taken quite a few centuries for them to be allowed to hold certain governmental positions and so on, and there was probably still some, perhaps a bit of local bigotry against them some places, but overall they were an incredibly well-integrated part of Danish society, and we only really realized they were Jews because they went to the synagogue instead of to the church on, well, you know, Fridays instead of Sundays, or Saturdays, or, excuse me, I'm not that into religious practices, so apologies for that. But anyway, the Danes wasn't actually, unlike some places like France and other places where, of course, they didn't particularly like the Nazis, certainly didn't like the Germans, and certainly didn't like the Germans, you know, stealing their population to put them in slaves and death camps. Of course, the death camp wasn't all that known, but there was still a sort of strong underlying current of long simmering anti-Semitism that allowed the Germans to have a good possibility of way of, you know, they had a lot of native helpers just because people didn't actually like the Jews either. In Denmark, that simply wasn't the case, and when it was starting to be rumored that there would possibly be pogroms against the Danish Jews, the population was basically ready to help. Told you, this is live, something is going to happen, but anyway, we're back. So anyway, when news spread that there was going to be something happening with the Jews, the population was ready to help. Now, in mid-1943, the situation in Denmark had intensified. The strikes had become ever more present. The first sort of real militant resistance group has, as I said, started to strike out, and Hitler gave the order to arrest all the Danish Jews and send them to Germany, while at the same time adopting a less conciliatory position towards the Danish authority. The local German governor, if you want to call him that, of Denmark was a fellow by the name of Werner Best. He had previously done some horrible things in other places, but in Denmark he was quite concerned that if he had power, because he was a civil administrator, and he basically had power because Denmark was a fairly peaceful country. I mean, there wasn't rioting in the streets, there were strikes, and there was some kind of rioting, but there wasn't a major situation. It wasn't a position where the German military would have to go in and take over the whole country administration that has happened some other places. So he wasn't actually all that interested in having things escalate, and he was quite well aware that if he decided to go in boots first and just kill or arrest all the Jews, the Danes wasn't actually going to take that lying down. But he still had to do it, of course, so what is a man to do? Well, one of the persons he needed to work with in order to have the Jews transported to Germany was a fellow by the name of Ferdinand Dockwitz, the German naval attaché in Denmark. Dockwitz didn't like the Nazis at all. He hated them, in fact, and he was definitely in contact, as far as Best would know, with government circles. I'm sure Best also probably suspected that Dockwitz was also in at least some very peripheral contact with members of the Danish resistance, which he was, by the way. So he, of course, let Duckwitz know what was happening, probably a bit sooner than he necessarily had to, in order to get the German ships ready to transport the Jews back to, Poland and Germany, to put them into camps. And Duckwitz, as I'm not sure best ever officially explained this was what he expected, but he told him, and Duckwitz then told it to Danish government and administrative circles, and through them it eventually got to, ordinary Danes and to the various resistance cells. And as expected, the Danes wasn't going to take this lying down. Now, what are we going to do? A full-scale uprising against the Germans still wasn't in the cards. There was absolutely no chance of that, and it wouldn't have helped. However, we have only a fairly narrow sound dividing us from Sweden. Sweden was neutral, and the Germans had absolutely no intention, or for that matter at the time, ability, to go over and conquer Sweden. So what happened was purely and simply that a bunch of people got together and did a little talking and decided to organize. So they went around talking to other people, and eventually they basically warned every single possible member of the Jewish population of Denmark that anyone could get into contact with, that at the Friday of Rosh Hashanah, so it was Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, if I'm not mistaken, as well as the Sabbath, so, the Germans weren't all stupid, they could sort of collect them while they were either gathered in their homes or in synagogues or whatever. But this would happen, and it might be a good idea if, say, Jewish school children stayed out of school that day, and every Jewish person might, get together a suitcase with as much money, jewelry, and clothes as they could possibly get, and, possibly take a short, unannounced trip into the countryside where they could meet up in various barns and churches and fishing huts and so on with various people who just might have access to, small ferries or barges or fishing boats and so on, and possibly just because it's so beautiful under the stars, they should do it at night. Well, that was basically what happened. Just before the German operation was about to start, practically every single Jew snuck out of their homes, snuck out of their schools, snuck out of their businesses, and vanished into the Danish countryside. Now, as I've said, Denmark is a very small country, and you can't hide in the countryside. So if that had, occurred more than a couple of hours, they would probably have been found and arrested the next morning. However, what instead happened was that the Danes have organized what was basically a small flotilla, a la the Dunkirk one, where it was just like private vessels and ferries that came from around the island of Sealand to a place that really shouldn't have been, and barges and so on, and in practically all harbors and fishing villages and so on across the north and eastern coast of Sealand, we loaded, or not we, but members of my family was actually there. Yay, go reflected glory. Loaded the Jews onto these barges and fishing boats and so on, and set them off towards Sweden, where, in fact, most of them reached and were safe for the rest of the war. So yeah. Now, how could this happen? Well, there was a couple of reasons. First of all, as I said, Werner Best wasn't all that interested in causing massive civil distress, and the German troops wasn't actually all that interested, because a lot of them liked Denmark. They liked being here. We were a Germanic people. We, like I said, we didn't particularly like Germans, but again, we were polite and kind and friendly, and we didn't, spit on them or try to stab them in the back all the time. So there are some stories that even some of the German people, soldiers, assigned to this particular operation, instead of kicking in the door of Jewish homes, they were politely knocking first, and perhaps even if no one was answered, they were leaving, instead of, again, knocking down the door to get people inside. Also, as I said, everyone was basically warned, so yeah. Overall, out of 7,000 plus Jews in Denmark, we managed to get, 7,000 plus Jews to Sweden. About, say, 180 was still caught in their apartments, usually because they were either elderly or alone or something, so they didn't really have a circle that could warn them. There were about 80 Jews caught in Gilleleje Church, which is a fishing village on the north of Zealand, and there was a couple of the ships and ferries caught by German military patrols on the sea on the way to Sweden. But overall, from 7,000 to 300, only about 450 Jews were actually arrested by the Germans. So, as you can imagine, this was considered an absolute catastrophic failure. To make things even better, of course, the Germans still at this point, because of Best, felt like they couldn't really antagonize the Danish government too much, so the Danes also managed to pressure the Germans into sending the Jews they did take to Theresienstadt concentration camps instead of perhaps directly to Treblinka or Auschwitz or any of the other extermination camps. Theresienstadt, of course, being the poster boy, if you can call it that, concentration camp, the one the Germans showed off to all the international journalists as to, look how nice we're actually treating the Jews here. They weren't starved too much. The slave work was somewhat useful, and there wasn't, of course, gas chambers and ovens there. In fact, to quote, and Marty will kill me now, I'm aware of it, but to quote Wikipedia, Theresienstadt was actually a fairly good place to be if you had to be in a concentration camp, because there was only the usual amount of murders and not actually extermination, which of course says something about the evil of the Nazis, that the usual amount of murders of inmates is somehow considered a positive thing. But anyway, we managed to get those particular Jews to Theresienstadt, and in fact were also allowed to, with something called the white buses, which was basically sort of Red Cross buses, we were allowed to send them stuff. So we basically send extra foodstuffs and medicines and supplies and so on directly to the Jews in Theresienstadt, and again, because it was this open to the public kind of concentration camp, it usually actually got to them. So overall, Denmark did manage. We don't have a lot to be proud about in the Second World War, at least not up until the last year or so when the resistance were actually truly gearing up. But we did manage to, out of 7,200-ish Jews, save the lives and freedoms of, well, more than 7,000 of them, despite the Germans' actual intention of trying to capture them. Yeah, there's been several movies made about this subject. There are several scholarly studies. That's why I'm not going into a, 30-minute video this time, but actually keeping it to a, for me, fairly short little video. But I found this to be actually fairly interesting, because it sort of shows what a population can do if they aren't actually, if they are willing to make an effort and without being separated by, hatred and so on and so forth. So yeah, this was how the Danish saved their Jewish population from the Nazis during the Second World War, by being friends with them, by wanting to get them out, by disliking the Nazis, and by cooperating with various Nazi leadership members who wasn't particularly keen on the Nazis. So yeah. And this is where I have a problem now, because now I'm just talking to the camera, so this isn't where I'm, my script is finished, but I don't know how to end this, so yeah. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to know more about the various details, please ask me in commentaries, and I will possibly, make a video about more specific details if you absolutely want to. But until then, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.